And I'm going to change the view. Okay, so again, chapter 25, verse 11 in the book of Deuteronomy, page 1134. The laws that we've been looking at are kind of random. This one we're going to see now has to do with two men who are in a fight. So if two men get into a fight with one another, and it says, if two men in the Hebrew, I think it's relevant, right? Ki yinatsu anashim yachdav, if two men fight together, ish v'achiv, a man and his brother, right? And I think, though it's not translated, it's important because what we're talking about are fellow Israelites. We're talking about something where they're not estranged, particularly their brother. There is a sense that they're on the same level. And now the wife of one of them comes to save her husband from the other. She puts out her hand, seizes him by the genitals. And if she does that, you shall cut off her hand, showing no pity. It's a shocking law and seems at odds with it. The penalty seems completely disproportionate to the act. Well, let's start with the penalty. Here, as in many places, the rabbinic reading of this is not mutilation. It is monetary compensation. So, and the reason the rabbis give a variety of reasons for this, but not the least of it is that, let's assume, for example, that this woman, for whatever reason, only has one hand, right? If you cut off her hand, then you would put her in an impossible situation, right? Different from that of a woman who has two hands, right? So the rabbis want to argue that it can't possibly mean what it seems to mean. And they, in general, in all cases like this, for example, when it says an eye for an eye, all of that kind of thing, it's all money. That's how they read it. Whether that was the original intent in the Torah or not, I would hope so. We don't really know. All the commentaries have trouble with this. Part of the fact that it's here may have to do with the fact that this was somewhat common in ancient times. The Assyrian laws seem to have something like this. The idea that grabbing someone's genitals could render them impotent, for example, variety of other things. Rabbinic interpretation also rushes to say that this is only legitimate, that the woman should only be punished if her husband was in mortal danger and there was no other way to save him. If that was the case, I'm sorry, I'm misstating this. Unless he was in mortal danger and there was no other way to save him, right? If that were the case, then if she did this, she wouldn't be punished at all. So this has to be less than that. It has to be, they're fighting and she intercedes, even though her husband is not in serious danger. She just wants to give him an edge, an advantage, right? Hard to say. I don't have a lot to say about this law. It's here. It makes the Jewish, not just us as moderns, but the Jewish tradition in general uncomfortable. And it may be just something that existed in the ancient world and gets included in the Torah. we're going to move on to something much more edifying at this point. And we're at verse 13, 25:13. And this has to do, we have in general an injunction in the Torah, tzedek tzedek tirdof. You have to pursue justice, right? You have to be as just as possible. And here we get a statement that in your pouch, right, we're thinking about a merchant, goes and sets up and has a pouch in which he has weights. These are stones, and they're supposed to have a specific weight, right? So the most common one is the shekel. We think about Israeli money today, right? Is shekel, right? So a shekel was a particular weight, and the merchant was supposed to have some shekels in his bag. You would have a scale, right? The merchant would put the item on one side and then the relevant number of shekels. If the item was supposed to be 3 shekels, you're going to sell 3 shekels worth. So you put in 3 shekels and you put in just enough merchandise so it balances. That's how it's done. The problem is that these are just stones. And so the merchant could have a big shekel and a little shekel in his bag, and the buyer would have no idea, right? So what you have to have is just weights, right? You can't have 2, one larger and one smaller, and you can't have it in your house either, right? You must be completely honest with your weights and your measures if you are to endure long on the soil that the Lord your God has given you. Whoever does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly is abhorrent to God, right? So this is about ethics in business. It's about being extremely careful. And the juxtaposition of this with the earlier law is really quite striking, right? Here, you really, and one assumes, they don't have, in our society, we do have inspectors who come around. This would be very hard to inspect. It would be very difficult, right? And so you simply have this injunction that you have to be very careful, right? You can't put your thumb on the scale, as it were. That's the English expression. Okay. And now we get this injunction about Amalek and remembering what Amalek did. So I want to ask you to turn back for a minute, because I want to look at the earlier emphasis, the earliest statement of this. So what we get is, I'm looking back to right. We get an attack. We're back in Exodus 17. And this is right after the Exodus from Egypt, right after they come through the sea, right? And they are attacked by the Amalekites who come against them. And attack them, and we get this statement that there is a war against Amalek, that they're attacked and they fight back. And if you look at page 421 in the Eitz Chaim, we're looking at verse, we can start, it's quite a scene. At the top of it, verse 9, chapter 17:9. So there's a battle, and Moses says to Joshua, pick some men for us, go out to do battle against Amalek. I will station myself on the top of a hill with the staff of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. When he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. Moses' hands grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands, and Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. So we get this battle, and somehow Moses is able to somehow encourage the people. It's not clear why or how, but they win. And then, and this is the relevant statement, then the Lord says to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder, read it aloud to Joshua. God saying, I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses set up an altar, named it Adonai Nisi. He said, it means hand on the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages. Now, other than the fact that the Amalekites attacked the Israelites when they first came out of Egypt, from the book of Exodus, from the original account, we don't know much about it. And it's really not clear why this battle should be generational, that somehow Amalek is singled out. But we come to a remembrance of it here in the book of Deuteronomy. So we're back in Deuteronomy, back on page 1135, chapter 25, verse 17. And Moses is telling the people, remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt, how, undeterred by the fear of God, he surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary and cut down all the stragglers in the rear, right? So now we get a description of the way Amalek, the people of Amalek, worked in this battle, right? That they took advantage of the fact that the people were weary, famished, and they attacked the stragglers. They came after the weakest among them, right? So this kind of behavior, right? It's not honorable warfare, right? It is terroristic in some ways. So, therefore, when the Lord your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God has given you as a heritage, you should blot out the memory of Amalek. Do not forget. Okay, so what does it mean to blot out the memory of Amalek? Right? Not to forget, to blot out the memory. So if you remember it, how is it that you've blotted it out? Right? And the emphasis is don't forget, remember to blot out the memory. Right? It seems somewhat internally contradictory. Either you remember or you blot it out, right? And what does it mean from generation to generation? Presumably, if you blotted it out, then there's no need to perpetrate it from one generation to another. And so in general, and I don't know if this is the original intent, in general, this seems somewhat metaphorically, that there will be people like this in every generation. And it is your obligation to blot them out. This particular passage is read right before the holiday of Purim, right? Because Haman is seen as the descendant of Amalek. And you see it a little bit in his genealogy, right? And so here it is, as the Haggadah says, in every generation they rise against us and God saves us. There will always be an Amalek, right? And it's our obligation to fight against them. I want to make another point about this, and that is who allowed these people to be the stragglers in the rear? Why weren't they taken care of? And so one of the messages I think that comes out of this is that we have to care for the people who are most vulnerable among us, lest the perdition of Amalek, or a modern equivalent of Amalek, come upon us. And I think we don't even have to think about Haman. We can think about Hamas, right? Who comes against, the most vulnerable, the aged, the babies, and so on. They are in some sense the embodiment of the Amalekites, and the obligation, therefore, to struggle against them, and in some ways to wipe them out. Not to wipe out a people, but to wipe out the Amalekites among them, or the spirit of Amalek among them. All right, I'm going to stop for a moment and open it up to any questions or comments about this. We've seen two different passages, right? Yeah, Barry, unmute. Barry, you need to unmute. I can't hear you. I still can't hear you. You have to unmute.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, got it.
Start.
In the passage in which the two men are fighting,
Yeah.
the wife grabs one of the men. Which man is she
Well,
grabbing?
presumably not her husband, right? The idea is she wants to support him
Okay.
in this battle. You
Okay.
can imagine the scene, they're kind of grappling with each other, and she reaches in between them and grabs him, grabs her husband's.
So that makes what you say makes more sense.
Yeah,
It's a little difficult to determine from the words that are, and then as far as with regard to what you just discussed, the Amalekites. So there's a classic example where you can't be asked not to think of something. In the classic example is that you're told to do not think of a pink elephant.
Right. How do you do that? Right. The idea I won't think about it immediately brings it to mind.
Right.
Yes. So here I think the idea is, remember, don't forget to, in each generation, when Amalek arises, don't forget to fight them, because they'll always be there and you'll always have to. And when you do, you're doing God's work. That seems to be
once again, your explanation makes the more sense.
Thank you.
Alternatives. Thank you.
Sure. Sandy, then Myra.
So, excuse me, King Saul was faulted for, I don't remember, he was supposed to wipe out, he didn't finish some battle.
Yes.
And then,
Yeah.
God.
Right.
I don't remember the details.
Right. So,
but he was faulted for not wiping out.
Yes. Yeah.
That enemy.
And there again, we have a descendant of Amalek, and in the case of Saul, it's really clear, because you have a genealogy, and the idea here is that, Saul loses the kingship for a couple of reasons. This is one of them, but we also see another one, and the punishment is that he loses the kingship. He didn't do several things he was supposed to do. One was they weren't supposed to take spoils, but he takes spoils, and they wipe out everybody but the king, right? So Saul somehow spares him, but it's in the book of Samuel. It's troubling. It is. because there we seem to see this very literally. And there it's really Amalekites. But a good point. Thank you for pointing it out. Other
Okay.
comments? Oh, Myra, go ahead.
Yeah, when mentioned Hamas, or whatever, Amalekite, I'm just wondering, would the Amalekites not be real people, but just in general bad people who you would call Amalekites?
Yes, I think that's exactly the point. Whereas we have a literal tribe at one point, their spiritual heirs continue.
They were a real tribe then.
I think they were. Yes. Yeah, no, the Torah seems very clear that there were Amalekites. But, you know, the idea that you will be fighting them in every generation, right, suggests that they become an archetype of a kind of enemy that has to be eradicated. And that's essentially what Israel is saying now about Hamas, right? We have to get rid of Hamas. If we don't, in a sense, they won't be fulfilling this commandment because they will continue to be preyed upon. And it is precisely innocents who will be preyed upon. Other comments, questions? If not, let's go on. We're entering a new phase here. And we're going to get to some stuff which really I think is quite interesting and you will recognize. So we're now going into chapter 26. The beginning of a new parsha, Ki Tavo. V'haya ki tavo el haaretz, when you will enter the land that the Lord is giving you. Remember, they're on the verge of going into the promised land. And Moses, like a lot of the laws that we've seen before this, they apply specifically in the promised land. God is giving this to you as your portion, your heritage, and you will possess it and you will settle it, right? So once you're settled in the land, the battles that are required for you to conquer it are over. You've settled down, and now you're busy and you have agriculture. And it says you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil that you harvest from the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Put it in a basket. Go to the place where the Lord your God shall choose to establish his name, right? So you're gathering up your produce. And in general, we have this idea that the first things belong to God. So you're not gonna take all of it, but you'll take some representative sample, and you're going to go to the place that God has chosen, to the temple, in other words. Once you're there, you will, or at least a temple. We don't necessarily have a sense that this is the temple in Jerusalem, right? That really comes later, but you go to a temple, and maybe it's a reference to Jerusalem, it's not clear, and you bring a basket, and you go there, and there's a priest, right, a Kohen, and you go there and you say, right, and you go to the Kohen, Asher yeh b'yamim hahem, in that time, amarta elav, and you shall say, and then it's going to be a quote. Higadati hayom, l'Adonai Elohecha, right? Higadati is from the Hagid. I say today before the Lord my God, right? Or the Lord your God, actually, because he's talking to the priest, but obviously it's also his God. So it's a declaration. The translation of I acknowledge is not really as accurate, I would say, as I declare. It's a declaration. And I want to emphasize the word higadati, because you see in that word a great similarity to a Jewish liturgical work, the Haggadah. Right? And you'll see why I'm emphasizing that in a minute, right? But it is a telling, it is a recitation, it's an announcement, and now we have it in quotes, right? This, in other words, here is a text that you'll go with your basket and with the first fruits in it, and you will now recite this text. And the text is, right? I declare today, right, to the Lord your God, that I have come into the land which God has sworn to our ancestors to give to us. So now, is this something that's relevant specifically to the first generation? In other words, is this, you go into the land, you settle down, and you who have gone into the land now bring some of the first fruits? It doesn't seem to be that way. It seems that this is something that gets done with the harvest every year. The rabbis understand this as applying any time between Shavuot and the end of Sukkot. During a harvest period, you're going to gather it in, you're going to take some of it, and you're going to go and make a declaration. Not clear that everybody does this every year, but it's clear that it's not just the first generation. You go to the temple, you bring your first fruits, you make this declaration. I've come, I acknowledge that I've come to the land that God has given us. And then the priest takes it and he puts it down in front of the altar, right? So this is a kind of offering that you're bringing. And then you say the following, right? Before God. This should be very familiar. My father was a wandering or fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but he became a great and populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us, oppressed us, imposed heavy labor on us. We cried out to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our plea, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, with awesome power and signs and portents, and brought us to this place, gave us this land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil that you have given me. Right? I don't think there's anyone who doesn't recognize this passage. It is the fundamental passage in the Passover hagadah. We don't do the first fruits anymore, right? And since the time of the Second Temple, we don't seem to have done them. But the rabbis, in their genius, took this passage and reused it. Right? They took it from, it's like cut and paste. They took it out, and there was a midrash which was created where each word, this midrash, right? Because it's the text of the Haggadah. They took the text with its midrash and they bring it in, right? As part of it. They reuse it in a sense. And that's true of a lot of things in the Jewish tradition, right? We see this in our services, for example, where the Shema becomes a part of our daily ritual or services. We see when we take the Torah out of the ark, Ein Kamocha, a biblical passage, just brought in, right? Reused. We see this again and again. So here, this is reused in the Passover Haggadah from this statement. And the connection which allows them to do this is because here it says you are supposed to speak it, right? You're supposed to, the language is higadati hayom. And then with respect to the obligation with respect to Passover, in the Torah, in the book of, I think it's in the book of Exodus, "V'higadeta levincha b'yom ha'u." You should, same root, you should declare, you should say to your son on that day, this is what God did. God took us out of Egypt, right? So the higadeta gets connected, and therefore they lift this based on the same word being used in both contexts, and they put it together in the Passover hagadah. It's interesting that this is all historical, right? It's not what you'd necessarily expect, right? In other words, what you would expect is, I've come in, I'm in this land, and we'll go down to the very end, a land flowing with milk and honey. Thank you for the blessings of this land. I'm bringing you the first fruits, right? That would seem to be enough. And yet what we have is the person who is making this declaration giving a brief historical memory of what brought the people of Israel to the land. That, and if you think about it, right, in some ways this deepens the experience. We were wanderers, right? We went down to Egypt. We came out. God brought us here. I'm not just grateful for this food. I'm grateful for being a part of this people who had this relationship with you that brought us to this moment, right? We see this in a lot of contexts where the Jewish tradition tries to introduce a historical context for a specific moment. So I can use this first fruits ceremony as a way of, how did I come to this place? How did I get this blessing? It's because God took our people and brought us through this experience. Again, we get the reference here, as we see in Deuteronomy in many places, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And I bring the first fruits from the soil which you have given me, right? Because God gave the Jewish people this land as an inheritance, right? So this is the culmination of the Exodus here. Now, this is the biblical view, that the culmination of the Exodus is entering the land. In some ways, the rabbinic view is different. The culmination of the Exodus from the rabbinic point of view, the emphasis is on coming to Sinai, right? And it's striking also because the Jewish people for most of our history did not live in the land. The rabbis in Babylonia who create the Babylonian Talmud did not live in the land. Right? So the idea here is, what is the purpose of the Exodus? One could say there are two purposes. One is to bind us to God. God becomes our people. We become God's people. God becomes our God. That's one of the purposes. And we receive that revelation on Sinai. And the other point is to bring us into the land. This is even more apparent if you look at the 4 cups of wine in the Passover Seder. Each cup represents a particular verb, that a particular thing that God did for the people, right? God redeemed us, saved us, took us out, right? Brought us to God. All of that, right? It's a series of verbs that are used way back when Moses is first commissioned by God. But that passage ends with a reference to the Holy Land. There should be a 5th cup. If you go back to that verse and the specific, right, it ends, "V'lakachtem li," and I brought you to me, and then goes on to talk about going to the land. The rabbis leave out, there's no 5th cup. There are only 4, even though there are 5 verbs. And the idea seems to, for them, the culmination, the climax is actually Sinai, and then this gets added. That's not the view in the Torah. For the Torah, this is a process from the beginning, going all the way back to the time of Abraham. The idea here is the purpose is to come to the promised land. Okay, so before we leave the first fruits, I'm going to open it up again. Any questions about this, Saul?
Yeah, I took out a hagadah while you were speaking, and it says here, Laban bikesh la'kor et hakol. He wanted to destroy everybody or uproot all. Okay, so that's probably coming from the Midrash.
Yes.
All right, because in the hertz that I have here, it says here, Arami Oved Ami Avi. There's a discrepancy here. One, some commentaries say this refers to Yaakov, Jacob, because of his straying and unsettled life, and then others the Haggadah, it refers to the Haggadah as saying Lavan sought to destroy my father, but there's a commentary that says Lavan wanted to destroy everybody, as opposed to Paro, who just wanted to kill the
Right.
males. So
First one. So it is the statement here is really unclear.
Yeah.
Right. And who is the Arami, right? Who is right? It is just to come back to it again, so I get the the Hebrew is Arami Oved Avi, right? And so you could read this, my father, Arami Oved Avi. The Arami, who is Oved, is my father. Or you could read it, an Aramean, right, did something to my father, right? And then I have to say, if that's the case, who is the Aramean? But if my father was this Arami Oved, then it's obvious that we're talking about the people of Israel and specifically perhaps Jacob, right? Or maybe going all the way back. So I think in the text, we're not talking about Lavan at all. We're not identifying Laban as the Arami who somehow mistreated my father, right? We're talking about the fact that my father, my ancestors, were wandering Arameans, that if you go back to where Abraham comes from and so on, Aram, right? So my father and Oved could be wandering, right? He was unsettled. He had no land, right? And we're going to start there. My ancestor, my father, had no land and went to sojourn in Egypt, right? He doesn't get land there either. God brings him out, and finally, he's not wandering anymore. And finally, now he receives this portion as an inheritance, right? So we go from the nomad who was unsettled to a place where I have land, and the earth is going to give me products, and I come to God and I'm grateful for it, right? That seems to be the pshat. Now, the problem, the Midrash, since you asked, the Midrash in the Haggadah is actually strange in itself, because the Midrash does talk about, which isn't intrinsic to the Haggadah, it's brought in, just as this text is brought in, the Midrash is brought in from outside. And the idea that Laban, and this is the Midrash's reading, was worse than Pharaoh makes absolutely no sense in the context. It's the most bizarre thing. First of all, because Laban in the text is no good. I mean, he's terrible. He mistreats Jacob. But they wind up with a treaty, and You know, the notion, I mean, Pharaoh wants to destroy the Israelites, kill every male child, right? So in its context, originally, it did not have to do with the Exodus at all, right? It's simply a statement that Laban was out to, in some sense, destroy Jacob, that individual. Bringing it here, it seems to be comparing it to the Egyptians, and that just doesn't work at all. It just doesn't. Because the whole point of the Seder is to tell us how bad the Egyptians were and that God saved us from there. Okay, thanks for the question. Barry, go ahead.
It seems to me that when they say from wandering Aramean to brought us down to Egypt, they seem to bypass the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the Promised Land.
Yes, Abraham, the point is that they don't actually settle there. You know, they have to keep leaving, there's famines, right? Abraham, when he buys the cave of the Machpelah, where he's going to bury Sarah, says, I am a ger, I'm a stranger among you, right? The idea of really being finally settled in the land doesn't really take place till after the Exodus, in that real sense. I mean, Abraham has title to that cave. We have in the Torah the actual negotiations and how much he paid and where it was, right? It's like a deed to our people's first piece of property in God's promised land, right? But going all the way back, and maybe it's worth looking at for a moment. Let me go back to it. To the
Hayei Sarah, right?
yeah, I want to go back even further than that. To the covenant that God makes with Abraham. Actually, two things. So, going back here to where is it?
Genesis 17.
Yeah. Yes, okay, yes, thank you. So, God says he's going to make in 17, he's going to make a covenant, and it's even before that, I think it's, yeah, here it is in 15. Right? So Abraham is put in a kind of trance, and God says to him, he makes him this promise that in a vision, and then he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, right, to assign this land to you as a possession. And Abraham says, how do I know I'll possess it? And then there's a little ritual. And then God says to Abraham, know well that your offspring will be strangers in a land not theirs. They'll be enslaved and oppressed. I will execute judgment. You will go out, right? You will go to your death, wealthy and so on. You go to your fathers in peace. And then after that, to your offspring, I will assign this land. God gives it to Abraham, but he doesn't really get to settle there. It doesn't become his, according to this initial vision, until the Exodus, until after the Exodus. So up to this point, he is perhaps one could say he and his descendants are wandering Arameans. Okay, any other,
So in,
Barry, go ahead and then
so
Sam.
this discussion can be expanded because there was a diaspora for 2,000 years. So once again, became strangers to the land.
Yes, I think so, although from the time we enter it, we claim it as our land. It becomes our land, and therefore we are in the diaspora. It is officially our land from the time we come in. And we may have been thrown out, but it's still our land, right? So we become part of a diaspora. But your point is well taken. And that's why I think the rabbi and the Jewish tradition really emphasizes Torah. Because Torah we can carry with us wherever we go. The idea that, if our only connection is to the land, we lose the land, we lose our identity. We're done, right? The Torah enables us to survive as a people without a land, without being able to be in our land. Sandy, you had something?
I had two questions. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had two questions. One is, what happens to those first fruits that are brought to the?
That's a good question. The Torah doesn't say. It may well be that the priests eat them.
Okay.
Because
Thank
a
you.
lot of what gets brought to the temple gets eaten by the priests. I suspect that they're not simply left there to rot.
Okay. And the second one is just continuing your point about rabbis looking at not just getting the Torah, but continuing on is clear in Dayenu, because it continues on after, if we had brought us to Mount Sinai without giving us the Torah, Dayenu, then it goes on to without leading us to the land of Israel, then without building the temple for us.
Right, it does. And I think that's right. But remember that, again, the Haggadah is a compendium, right? So I would maintain that the 4 cups, right, are putting the emphasis on Sinai. Dayenu is not. Dayenu wants to talk about coming to the temple, the land, and ultimately seeing the temple as the fulfillment of the Exodus, right? There's actually, since I mentioned it, I'll also mention this. There is this question which is asked, what about the 5th cup? Shouldn't we have a cup for that last verb that says God not only took us out, but brought us to the land, right? And so, in a sense, we do. We have a cup we don't drink, right? Which is Elijah's cup. So why is it called Elijah's cup? You might think, well, that somehow this has to do with Elijah's going to come and, it'll be the Messianic era. And there is a sense of messianism in the Torah, in the Haggadah. I think there really is. But the classic rabbinic explanation is that Elijah is the one who resolves halachic questions that we're not able to resolve. It's called Elijah's cup because Elijah will come and tell us whether we should be using it or not. That is the classic answer. On the other hand, everything after the meal you could say is somewhat messianic. And opening the door for Elijah, not Elijah's cup per se, but opening the door for Elijah. Elijah is supposed to be the harbinger of the Messiah. And there is in the Passover Seder the sort of a notion, before the meal, we're talking about the redemption from Egypt. After the meal, we're in a sense saying, you gave us that physical redemption, now give us the spiritual redemption. We don't want there to be any more Egypts, right? Take us to the next step, bring the Messiah, bring it on, right? So that from the point of view of the second part of the Seder, the first part is a paradigm of deliverance. And now in the second part of the Seder, after the meal, we're asking God to finish it, right? Ultimately to bring us into not just the land of Israel, but into the Messianic era. Okay, last question from anyone before okay, so as I generally do, we will not have class for the next 2 weeks. We're gonna begin again right after New Year's. Okay, generally I take a break now, and I'm going to, and then we're gonna start in, and this is actually a pretty good place to take a break. We're gonna look at one more of these rituals, another declaration, and then we're moving on, we're picking up the historical stuff again. We're going to be talking about rituals that take place when the people come into the land, very specific things that they have to do as they enter. And then we're going to have a series of blessings and curses. Curses are horrific, awful curses. And then we're going to be coming really towards the end, the very end of the book. So I would say once we come back in January, another 3-4 sessions maybe, and then we'll move on to look at Joshua. So that's where we're going. As always, I thank you. I'll see you in not next Tuesday, right? Actually, are we talking about 2 weeks? When next week is the 26th, right? So, and then the week after that is the 2nd. So we're only skipping 1 week. The day after New Year's, I will be back. I'm going to wish you a happy secular New Year now. I had miscalculated the days, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Great.
All right, everybody. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.